serving as the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. My little logo back here. We are all on Zoom these days from our living rooms, and I'm no different than anyone else. It's so strange to be in this period of time where I think probably more people are civically engaged than any other time, probably since World War II. And with this engagement, we still have a presidential election going on. All of these factors that are happening, like mail-in ballots, things that we didn't even think about a few months ago, but now we are, and we're tackling those issues. And the New Hampshire Institute of Politics is carrying on as we are and have been doing with a series of events and podcasts and other activities to keep people civically engaged. If you want to turn away from some of the pandemic situation, you want to focus again on politics, which is a great place to be. Here's your opportunity. So this is a special night for us. We're very happy. I want to just tell everyone that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube afterwards. So if you couldn't make it, it'll be on YouTube. And for purposes of introduction, I want to turn this over to Matt Solomon, one of our outstanding student ambassadors. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Neil. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So Charlotte Alter is a national correspondent at Time Magazine covering politics and social issues. She has covered the 2016, 2018, and 2020 campaigns, the Women's March and anti-Trump resistance, and the rise in activism around gun violence and climate change. Her coverage often has a special focus on women in politics, social movements, and youth activism. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband, writer and journalist Mark Chiazzano, 2 pink chairs, and 1 dying planet. So the way that this event is going to go, it's going to be fully question and answer based. We already have a lot of questions prepared by students of St. Anselm College who have read your book, Charlotte, so that's great. And then the audience is also welcome to submit questions too. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a question and answer chat box. You can feel free to type questions in there as they come up. We're going to start with a student question that Christina Damian, my co-host, has prepared. As Charlotte is answering the question, feel free to put anything you want in there. We'll try our best to get to every question, but we don't want to go on for too long, so we might not get to it. But with that, thanks for being here, Charlotte, and over to Christina.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Matt, it's really great to be here, and I just want to let everyone know that the plant, unfortunately, is no longer with us.
Oh, it's dead? Wow, that's so sad.
Yeah.
Well, without further ado, I'm going to jump into the first question coming from Erin White. She asks, in chapter 4, you talk about the revolution in technology that took place in the early 21st century. As someone who was born into this revolution, I feel that my experiences regarding technology are much different than those who are highlighted in the book, because I am much younger. Do you think that leaders in my generation will think differently because of this, and how so?
That's a great question. Absolutely. I do think that leaders in your generation will think differently. This book, as you guys probably know, was very specifically focused on millennials. So that's people born between 1981 and 1996. And so what that meant, and just to summarize a little bit the chapter that the questioner is talking about, that chapter was about how millennials were in many ways sort of a bridge generation in terms of technology. People in that generation, which I am a millennial, people our age were sort of old enough to remember what things were like before the internet, old enough to call our friends on landlines, old enough to not have cell phones, old enough to not really have access to the internet from the moment that we were born, right? Most people born in that time period remember the moment that they got internet, or if they don't remember the exact moment, they remember, oh, I was 8 or 9 years old, or I was 11 or 12 years old, or I was 15 years old, whatever it is. Your generation of college students, most people your age will have never remembered a moment before the internet. So you are wholly of the digital age in a way that millennials are almost kind of the bridge between the pre-digital age and the digital age. So I think that absolutely is going to shape how people your age think. In fact, because I just wrote this story for Time about the class of 2020, which I recommend you guys read. But one of the things that I learned in reporting that story was that actually they've done these studies that measure kind of general happiness, right? General sense of well-being, sense of feeling connected to people around you. And one of the researchers who studies both millennials and Gen Z, and also just generational trends in general, her name is Jean Twenge. She found that starting in 2012, teens, so like kids who were 15, 16 years old, started reporting much higher levels of depression and anxiety and mental illness and just general unhappiness. And when she dug into the research, she found that it was very highly correlated with the invention of social media, and like the idea that social media was, for many people your age, a totally universal experience. It wasn't something that like some people were doing and some people weren't, or maybe, you know, if your parents let you, you did, but not everyone did. Like, you know, for people in Gen Z, so having a cell phone and using it to go on social media is like a default, right? And so she found that had a significant impact on health and happiness for Gen Z. But what was kind of interesting about what she found was that it wasn't that the use of social media made people unhappy. It was that using social media instead of doing other things made people unhappy. So it wasn't the presence of social media, it was the absence of doing things like going to the movies with your friends, or going to a party, or, you know, going on a fun trip, going on a walk, or like sort of experiences in the physical world. She found that basically a lot of kids were sort of not having sexual experiences that early generations had. They weren't drinking. They weren't, like, all these things that seem like it should be good. Like, oh, great, less teen drinking. Oh, great, you know, like less sex. Like, that seems like a good thing, but when it's paired with like deep, deep unhappiness, it's actually kind of not a great thing. So that is a very long answer to the question, but yes, technology is absolutely shaping you guys in tremendous ways. And I don't think we even know the extent to which, the full extent of what that might look like, especially now that people are going to school online. So who knows?
Kind of to follow up of that question. So this is my question, not a student, although I'm technically a student. How do you think that the use of technology and the fact that Gen Zers are defaulted into technology, how do you think that affects their political participation? Because, you know, I feel like we could probably see that Gen Zers are a lot more active online with politics, but might not have that, you know, actually going like to the polls and voting that maybe millennials do. So do you think that there's a correlation there? And how do you think that fits in?
I think it's a great question. I think it's tricky because there are some ways in which Gen Z because there are some ways in which, you know, growing up online has given Gen Z a much more sophisticated understanding of a lot of these political issues, particularly around race and identity, particularly around climate change, particularly around guns. Gen Z, you know, I think having the internet, which allows you to talk to anybody all over the world, has allowed people to sort of build communities and build identities and build movements with people that they don't physically live near, right? However, the way that I think we're coming up to in the next, I'm not saying this is gonna happen in the next 5 years, but over the next couple decades, I think we'll be coming to an interesting moment where sort of two different worlds are going to be crashing up against each other, right? Because our political system is still based on the idea of physical location, right? Somebody who lives in Minnesota is voting for Minnesota representatives and Minnesota senators, and they, for all intents and purposes in our political system, are acting as Minnesotans, like that might not be the right phrase, but in a way that, you know, somebody who's living in New York or in California is identified by their physical location, in that they vote for people who are representing that physical place. I don't, I think having your political awakening be divorced from a physical location has really interesting implications for what politics might look like. I also think, in particular, mail voting presents real problems for millennials and Gen Z, simply because a lot of millennials and Gen Z have trouble with the mail. I mean, postage, going to the post office, getting stamps, all of that stuff is like are not things that come totally naturally to people in our generations, because it's not the way we communicate. In the way that boomers, the idea of sending a letter is like whatever, they've sent millions of letters over their life. So that's actually one thing I really worry about with this election in particular, is that mail presents, I know a lot of older people roll their eyes at this and they're like, what's the problem? It's so easy, just stick it in the mail, whatever. It is, it's confusing for a lot of younger people who aren't that familiar with it. And also there are a lot of people, younger people especially, who like move, you know, they sublet 3 different apartments in a year, you know, their rent keeps going up. So maybe they're moving to a different place, and maybe their absentee ballot goes to their old apartment and not their new apartment. And I just think it presents some structural challenges for them.
Thank you, Shara. That's super interesting to hear about how the voting can be impacted by all those factors that you mentioned. We actually have another question from one of our students named Shane, who's asking about gender votes, and he asked us to ask. We often hear when a male candidate is running for office, they target the woman vote. In this chapter, you outline a variety of different campaigns run by women. Can you speak more towards how much pressure is put on female candidates to secure the male vote, and how difficult that this task is in a society that has suppressed female empowerment for so long, especially in more purple states?
Wow, what a great question. So one of the things, unfortunately, unfortunately, I think we'll say, is that, you know, women are, like people of color, often otherized when they're discussed as a voting bloc. So I have almost never, frankly, heard anybody talk about the male vote. Trump, in particular, seems to really be going for the male vote. He won the male vote. The male vote is extremely important to him, but to his, not to him personally, but to his electoral strength. But, you know, women tend to, particularly in these purple areas and particularly in these suburban areas, tend to be a little bit swingier and just tend to be more likely to shift. And I think that's what we saw, particularly between 2016 and 2018, is that the areas that swung from Trump in 2016 to a Democrat in 2018, a lot of the votes that swung were women. And I think that says a couple things. One, it says that maybe some of those women, you know, we know that in particular, white women voted for Trump by, you know, I think it's 52 or 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. So it is very important to recognize that, like, women of color have been solidly Democratic and have voted for Democrats up and down the ballot really predictably and solidly for years. So these swingy votes tend to be white, suburban, baby boomer / Gen X women. But the swing tells us 2 things. One is that it's very possible that these white women were sort of reluctant Trump voters to begin with. They voted for him maybe because they had a deep-seated, you know, a deep-seated hatred of Hillary Clinton, maybe because they thought he would be good for the economy, maybe because the men in their life were really excited about him and they decided to give him a chance. Maybe because they wanted a change. It could be any or all of those reasons, but the swing tended to be among women in that race, and I think we're already seeing in this race in 2020, we're already seeing those suburban women. They're very clearly a key target for Biden because he's really leaning into this sort of decency, empathy character campaign. And I think that that's very much designed to reach them. But what is kind of interesting is that particularly like the women, congresswomen that you are asking about, they didn't all, particularly in the purple states, it wasn't like a rah-rah feminism campaign. And I think that what that shows is that the power of women voters and the feminist movement are overlapping, but they're not identical. So for example, the Women's March, the anti-Trump resistance, the rise of intersectional feminism, all of these things that we know happened in the aftermath of Trump's election, that is a very specific set of extremely progressive and politically active women, many of whom do not live in swing states. The women who won the midterms for Democrats in 2018 were a different, many of them also did go to the Women's March. Certainly there were swing voters in purple states who went to the Women's March. But a lot of these women were in indivisible groups where they were sort of not quite as activist-y, but definitely more sort of involved in civic engagement. And so I think it's important when it's important to recognize that there are sort of like all different ways to slice this pie, right? But I do like the framing of the question. Like I really haven't ever heard anybody talk about trying to get male votes. And I think that's partly just because men in this country are not considered a voting bloc in the way that women are, even though women do not vote as bloc. So that's kind of interesting. Sorry, I have a couple peanuts here. Is it okay if I eat that?
No worries. So this next question comes from another St. Anselm College student. It's also long and a very intelligent question, so sorry. Our students are very smart. So this comes from Emily Burns. She says that in chapter 3, so she's citing sources here, you discuss how the cost of college has increased drastically, leaving millennials in immense debt. In your opinion, is there a way to fix this, or do you think our higher education system is past help due to the immense changes many colleges and universities have implemented to keep up with the increase of students applying for college?
It's a great question. I absolutely do not think that this is beyond redemption. In fact, I think of all the problems that we have in this country, student debt is among the simplest to solve because there are many ways to get there. There are many, many different ways to reduce or eliminate the student debt burden for people who carry debt, and also to prevent future students from taking on this tremendous amount of debt. You can't, for example, tackling climate change is way harder than tackling student debt. I think that it's tricky because it is obviously a very controversial issue, because you also have people out there who say, I paid for college, like where do you draw the line? If you graduated in 1999, do you get your loans forgiven, but not in 1998? There are people out there who say, I paid off my loans, I worked a job I hated to pay off my loans, like, am I gonna get my money back? Like, there are all these questions, and this is why I'm a journalist, not a legislator, because, like, I'm not the person who's gonna come up with the specifics of that solution. But I also think that, and you already see this happening with some initiatives that are being proposed right now. I think that the student debt crisis provides the real opportunity also to one, take advantage of I don't mean take advantage as an exploit. I mean to like utilize this incredibly educated workforce that we have, but also to in some ways subtly direct people towards majors and focuses that could be beneficial, right? So for example, I could see a world where maybe, you know, if, for example, and I'm spitballing here, right? I'm sure there's a million problems with my ideas on this. I could see a world where, like, we know that we need to plant 10 billion trees to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I could see a world where it's like, okay, you know, if you have a tremendous student debt burden, if you work a 6-month shift planting trees, it's gone, you know, or it's significantly reduced. Or if you work for, you know, Senator Warren just proposed a new idea for a coronavirus task force, like basically a CCC, which was a New Deal era program that FDR created, but to tackle COVID. And I don't believe that she specifically tied it to student debt, but I could see a world where it's like, you know, if you sign up to be a contact tracer and help fight coronavirus, you get a significant portion or all of your debt reduced. Basically what I'm trying to say is that the GI Bill, which was the bill in the 1940s that told young American men that if they joined the Army, they could go to school for free. That idea of that bargain that, you know, if you do something of service to your country will pay for your education. I think that can go in both ways, right? So during the GI Bill, it was like, first you fight in the war, then you go to college. That's the deal. I could also see a world where it's like, okay, you went to college already, or you went to graduate school already. You are graduating with all this debt. Here are a variety of service options that are like of benefit to our society that are not going to fight in a war, although maybe that could be one of them, you know, that are planting trees or caring for the elderly or, you know, working at a government daycare center or whatever, where you get paid, but it's maybe not like the thing that you want to do in your life. And, or you work at a school in a low income community, or you, you know, any number of things that are sort of, that we agree are for the are sort of service projects for the strength and benefit of our country. And the deal could be that if you do a couple of years or a couple months or whatever it is doing that, then you get your debt forgiven. So I could definitely see a world, and I would like to see a world where we have a national service, a culture of national service that is tied to eliminating and forgiving student debt, so that once you serve your country, you can get the monkey off your back and you don't have to carry around $100,000 of debt for the rest of your life.
Great, well, thank you for that. We're at St. A's, we're very big on service, so that's really cool to hear you spitball a little bit about how that could be a trade-off with debt. So our next question comes from Lizzie Manning, and she wants to know, you talk a lot about Dan Crenshaw's experience at Harvard and how he was an outsider as a conservative in a liberal environment. Do you feel that many millennial conservatives feel this way as well?
Yeah, I do. I think that what I found in my research was that with some significant exceptions, and I think abortion is a significant exception here, but with some significant exceptions, on a lot of issues, millennial conservatives were sometimes more similar to their millennial liberal peers than to older conservatives. Like climate change is a good example. Millennial conservatives understand the science of climate change and believe that the government has to do something about it. They just don't necessarily agree with the same solutions that millennial liberals do. On immigration, millennial conservatives tend to be more more for a pathway to citizenship, more supportive of DACA. Same-sex marriage is another place where millennial conservatives tend to believe in marriage equality. They think the ship has sailed. They're not trying to fight that battle anymore. However, talking to millennial conservatives, one of the things that comes up over and over again is this idea of a culture war. And that even if they have areas of common ground with their liberal peers, they feel so judged and they feel so kind of isolated and antagonized that they can't ever like reach that common ground, even though there's a lot of common ground to be had. And talking to millennial conservatives, it's very clear to me, and I'm curious if any conservatives here want to weigh in on this, that sort of one of the biggest forces driving young people towards the Republican Party is not actually that they love Donald Trump or that it's so attractive or they agree with him on all these issues necessarily, although some of them do. It's more that they feel like they feel judged by millennial liberals, and they feel like there's a tone and a culture of sort of sanctimonious, progressive wokeness, maybe, that they feel like it's a language they don't speak. And I think, and I heard a lot from millennial conservatives specifically talking about language, things like they felt like they said the wrong thing, they didn't know the right term for this, they messed up some pronouns, things that are like that, that they felt like they kind of messed up in some way, and that the liberals in their college like pounced on them, and it made it really hard for them to like kind of feel like any sort of sense of community. They've just felt attacked. So that's, that's why I think that's one of the trends that I see emerging here, and I think it's a really troubling one, because I do think that young conservatives are falling into a posture that's not even really pro-Trump, it's just anti-Trump. So it's not even necessarily pro-conservative, it's just against the progressives, against millennial progressives, because of essentially the tone of a lot of the discourse on the left right now. They feel like it is judgy, and they feel like they feel like there's not a safe place for them to say, hey, listen, we have real differences on this issue. We have real similarities on another issue. We have real differences on this other issue. Can we talk about it? I think a lot of millennial conservatives in particular right now, especially in the Trump era, feel like they're being called a racist all the time. And there's a long conversation to be had about whether that's fair or not, but the point is that they feel that way and they feel attacked by that, and that's one of the strongest forces that's driving them away from the middle. Whereas where they kind of naturally, many of them naturally are a little bit more in the middle, but they're driven to the right by the language coming from the left.
It's really interesting. It gives a lot to think about. And I want to follow up again. So this is my question. And I don't want to ask you what's the fix for that, because I know that you don't know, and I don't know, and I don't know if anybody knows. But it's interesting because, a lot of the themes that we've already talked about and you've already discussed, I feel like kind of fuel that, like the presence of technology, social media, of the way that people sort of organize now. And in addition to that, you talk a lot about AOC and a lot of the really progressive Democrats in your book, and how that's sort of a sect of Democrats that are, that sort of, we need to tear down the system in like a good way to fix it sort of thing. And how that's, that's good when you pair it with the Pete Buttigieg sort of Democrat. But what I'm thinking now is, as much as that sort of energy helps progress the party and progress civic engagement, I'm thinking of my peers who I see, on social media all the time, the parts that they really like about AOC, even though she does so much and she works countless hours harder than, a lot of Congress people there, doing a lot of bipartisan things and nonpartisan things and all of this, people love when she tears Republicans apart in a hearing, or when she says something, and the same thing, any of her fellow Congress people, it's when they attack someone. I feel like there's a lot of sort of like you want to be attacking the other side. So, do you think that there's a way to dial back on that? I feel like the presence of technology really harpens on that. It's kind of like a cyberbullying thing, like, where it's now that we've brought politics online and you're behind a screen, it's so much harder to bring people to the table in a civil way. And especially when you've got all of those groups that are sort of highlighting the attack and the negative aspect of politics. So any thoughts on?
Totally. I mean, you're completely right. There is a new incentive to go viral, and the things and what we know is that tech companies, in particular Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, the algorithms reward attack behavior. The algorithms of like how to go viral on Twitter, how to get a lot of views on YouTube. A video of four congressmen, four members of Congress from different parties getting into a room and talking, with respect about and their differences and issues and where they can find common ground. That is never going to go viral. And unfortunately, that is the point of politics. And so I think in some ways, politics as it exists on the internet versus this is again what I was talking about before, these two things crashing up against each other. The old way, which is in some ways the Nancy Pelosi way and the Mitch McConnell way, and the old way, which is like getting people into a room together and hashing it out and saying like, hey, listen, I don't like this bill, but I'll give you my vote on this if you vote for my bill that's coming up next week. And, I'll do this if you give me this, if you put this thing in, like all of that, like that is how our system is designed to work. And I think that there are very legitimate critiques of that. Obviously, it excludes a lot of people. Obviously, there's a lot of room for that to be exploited by moneyed interests and all of these things that we know are huge problems and why the system is deeply flawed. It's also the way that the American system has worked for 250 years at this point. So it's very hard for something that's been going on for 250 years to like then be turned on its head in, really we're talking about a less than a 5-year period, maybe even less than that. I mean, probably 5 or 6 years, by new technology that has created an entirely new set of incentives, basically. So I think it's going to be really interesting.
Great. It's interesting you bring that up with like viral moments, because I know I've seen clips where someone is on the floor of the in Congress and they're giving this really heart-wrenching speech, but there's no one in the room to see it. It's all for those like actual viral moments. So going off of that, this is again one of my own questions, and I'm going to combine it with another student of ours. How do you think this impacts millennials and Gen Z? Like, do you think this is pushing people to go out and actually participate in politics? Like, is it getting people excited, or do you think it's discouraging? And in conjunction with that, how do we get young people mobilized out and working on campaigns if they're not interested in politics to begin with?
So when you say how does this impact, you mean the internet? What do you mean by this?
I mean those viral moments that we see, like that,
right.
Where it could be polarizing, where someone might be really inspired by it, but then also someone might not believe in what the other person is saying.
Right. I mean, I do think that one thing about virality in general that helps bring young people into the system is that it it creates an opportunity for them to hear about politics from their friends and from people on their Facebook. I mean, most of you guys aren't on Facebook, Twitter feed, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is you're using, rather than, like, you're never going to turn on C-SPAN and be like, oh, that's my congressman. Yeah. Like, so in some ways, like, you know, seeing a viral clip of AOC that your friend shared to their Instagram story, that means that's like one more, you now know more about AOC than you did 5 minutes before that. You now know more about Congress. You probably know what a hearing is. You know, you probably know that Congress is talking about this thing. So like, it just in general creates more spread of this information, and more people are thinking about it. So in that sense, I think it's really good. I also think, you know, I think that there are real questions about, like I said before, you know, online politics versus real on the ground politics. And I think, in fact, the clearest example of the disparity there is what we saw with the Bernie Sanders campaign. Because the Bernie Sanders campaign had one of the best online machines ever. And they went viral constantly. And people online loved Bernie. They loved to dunk on people who hated Bernie. Like, it was like if you only looked at what was happening online, Bernie obviously won. You know, like he obviously dominated the internet. But our system doesn't work that way. Our system, the winner in our system is determined by who human beings made of physical cells who live in physical locations decide to pick. And the voters in Michigan and the voters in South Carolina picked Joe Biden. And it kind of didn't matter. The chatter online about Bernie ultimately helped him get really far, helped him get farther than any progressive has ever gotten. He's clearly going to have a tremendous amount of impact on the Democratic platform. He clearly, you know, has already, as I've laid out in the book, already fundamentally shaped the demands of the orientation of the Democratic Party in all these ways that I don't need to describe to you. But politics is about winning elections. And elections are won by convincing human beings who live in the relevant places that you need to win why your way is better, why you're the best candidate, why your ideas are better, why you are the person they should vote for. And so one challenge that I think millennials and Gen Z will have, which is already a challenge that we see happening with the progressive movement, is mistaking online political engagement for actual political power and actual political momentum. And, you know, like, listen, I think Michigan is in some ways the best example of this, right? Because here's what happened. So in 2016, Bernie Sanders won the Michigan primary against all the odds. It was a huge upset. He won the Michigan primary against Hillary Clinton. And then in the general election, Hillary lost Michigan to Trump, and that's one of the things that made Trump president, right? So because of those two facts, the narrative emerged over the last 4 years that Bernie, because he'd won the primary, would have won the general, and that therefore Bernie would have won Michigan and Bernie would have been able to beat Trump. And that was in some ways the single, like Bernie winning Michigan fed Bernie beats Trump. And that was the core of Bernie's message in 2020, was that he could have won in 2016 and therefore he would win in 2020. And you saw that online everywhere. It was everywhere. And then in 2020, not only did Bernie lose Michigan in the primary, it wasn't even close. It wasn't even a squeaker, really. It wasn't like, oh, he lost by just a couple. It's like he flatly lost. And So then it just raises these questions of like, okay, if the voters of Michigan are really the people who are deciding who wins the Michigan primary, who wins the Michigan general, and then who wins the Michigan primary again in 2020, like, how do we square that with this online narrative that has really been created about what would have happened, what could have happened, who, like, you know, and it created this false sense that Bernie Sanders had all of this support in Michigan that he didn't really have, you know, and the proof is in the pudding, kind of. I like to say, and people don't like this, unfortunately, but it's true. I like to say that only winning is winning. And one thing that I've noticed, I've noticed this particularly among younger activists, is this tendency to twist things that aren't winning into wins. You know, we didn't win, but we came really close. We didn't win, but we got more votes than anybody else ever who had our positions. Like, we didn't win, but we had record turnout among this group. And it's like, our system, fairly or unfairly, is oriented around people who win elections. And I think that that for young people involved in politics and interested in politics, the idea of winning can't be optional. It can't be like we're gonna build a movement and like it'll be great if we won. Like, winning the seat, winning the race, winning the election you can't get anything done unless you do that. And so I think that that's one of the big things big tensions that's going to emerge when it comes to sort of online politics versus real world politics, because I think increasingly you're going to see people who are winning online, but not winning in real life. And I think and I really, frankly, am worried that that's going to create a sense of disillusionment, create a sense that the system, that, you know, that something's being rigged, or create a sense that something's being faked or whatever. And listen, there certainly are a lot of things that are real problems with the way our system is run. And there are many, many people who are disenfranchised from voting, and many people, particularly communities of color, who, you know, don't get to vote in the way that they should. But also, I think there are a lot of assumptions made often about how those disenfranchised voters would have voted. And there's a lot of, you know, people like to say, you know, you know, this polling place closed in this community, and if it had been open, everyone would have voted for my candidate. And sometimes that's not actually necessarily true. So I think we have to be really careful about counterfactuals like that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I feel like that online world that we've been talking about, that sort of like warped perception of what American politics is and how it's so different from how it actually works. I feel like those people actually believe that their way of thinking about politics is how it works. And that it is scary. Like you said, that's a terrifying thought process. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to resist the urge to ask any more of my own questions because we still have student questions. But if anybody in the audience wants to ask some, you can put it in the question and answers and we'll try to get to it. So this
I'm so long-winded.
Yeah, this comes from a student, Ryan Heath, and he asks, when discussing the approaches young people have taken to politics, you set up a dichotomy between fixing the system and tearing it down. Is it possible or even necessary to do both in order to affect change, or can we only do one?
Definitely both. I mean, in some ways, I think that that's the point of the book, is that you have to have both. And that having only one leads to either chaos or stasis. And you sort of need to have both of those things to have a progress moving forward. I mean, I think the question is, you know, I think that this boils down to tactics and temperament often, you know, like the question is like, we live in the real world, right? So for example, healthcare is a really good example of this dichotomy. You have some people who say, let's blow up the entire healthcare system. Nobody, like, private health insurance shouldn't exist. Health, like, everything we know about the healthcare system as it currently works in the United States, we should go back to the drawing board. Then you have people who are like, you know, the system is really, really flawed, but if we expand Medicaid, if we improve the ACA, if we, you know, get more funding for child health care, if we get more subsidies for states, like, we can create a patchwork of a system that works. You, like, keeping what we already have and improving it. And so I think that in those two conversations where, like, these people talk to these people, one mistake that I hear people making a lot is making it too theoretical, making it like, well, we want to get rid of the whole system. Well, you can't get rid of the whole system, blah, blah, blah. When in fact, they should just be talking about how to get people healthcare, you know? And, like, the place to meet in the middle is not, nobody is going to win a theoretical debate about to what extent should you destroy the system or preserve the system or reform the system. But an answer can be found on, you know, like, what parts of this person's plan make sense and what part of this person's plan makes sense, and can we put them together, and how can they, you know, like, and that is where I think that's where I think progress happens, is when the people who are thinking outside the box are patient with the people who are still in the box, and when the people who are still in the box are patient with the people who are thinking outside the box and explaining, you know, and I don't think we get anywhere unless they work together.
So this question comes from the audience, from Kathleen. It's a really good one. I think it kind of ties in a lot of things that we've been talking about. So she asks, how do you get the younger generation to accept the system the way it is so that they can go into it and try to affect change from the inside? So how do you make it so that they don't see it and think that, you know, by joining it, you know, they're going to become part of it? You know, how do you give them hope that they can actually make a change?
It's a great question. I think a lot of it is seeing people who are doing it. But I also think a lot of it is sort of real talk about, like, what, and I think some of this is maturity and some of this is just time. But I think a lot of this is real talk about, like, that we live on planet Earth, right? You know, and so, like, it's not a choice between, you know, an imperfect leader and a perfect leader. It's all choices are between imperfect options, and particularly in a country that is that has so many different competing interests and has such a diverse population, and like, you know, that one of the things that I think is really challenging to getting young people involved in politics, and frankly in everything, is this idea of purity and the idea that flaws of any kind are disqualifying. And I think that that, listen, AOC isn't perfect. Bernie Sanders isn't perfect. None of the, you know, like, there is no such thing as somebody who is a perfect leader, a perfect specimen of correct thinking or, you know, moral thinking. And one of the things that I try to help young people understand is that the beauty of our system is that it's designed to grapple with imperfection. That's the reason the American system is so, even though it's so flawed and awful, is ultimately so miraculous, is that it's designed to be a choice between two imperfect people so that people can choose who of these two imperfect options is better for me or is better for what I want. Not where's the knight on the white horse who's perfect in every way, who believes exactly what I believe, and, like, oh, he's not here, well, I guess I won't vote. And the thing that's great about our system is that, if you pick one imperfect option and then it turns out that they were worse than you thought, or it turns out that they do something that you hate and turns out you can't stand them, guess what? You can vote them right out, And so I think one of the ways that I would encourage people to think about this is to get away from this perfectionism, which doesn't help anybody, and towards a sense of working towards ideals in a way that is like practical and also recognizing human fallibility. People are going to say stuff that you don't like. People are going to make votes you don't like. People are going to make mistakes. People are going to have friends you don't like. People are going to have whatever, because that's the system that we are working within. So does that answer your question? I don't know if I really answered it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that gets it. I think, if you make sure that voters and younger people just understands what they're going to actually be going into, what they're actually going to be seeing, that's a good first step. It's kind of like what we were talking about before, like their perception of politics is not what it is. So it's easy to get disillusioned, but if we do our best to try to take those white knights off of their horses so that people know that, that's what politics is.
Yeah, I think it's really a question of making the perfect the enemy of the good. Ultimately, I think politics has the potential to do a lot that's good and almost nothing that's perfect. And so if you want some good, getting into the political system is a great way to do it. If you only want perfect, it's probably not for you.
Yeah. Well, we are unfortunately towards the end of this webinar, so we're gonna wrap up with one final question. That's a mix of a bunch of people's questions to try to get to them all. So looking towards the future of politics and when more of Gen Z can be of legal age to actually run for office, do you see that a new generation of politicians that will be coming in will be more partisan or bipartisan in government, and how will this affect parties?
Great question. I don't know about partisanship for this generation. So, okay, I think that there's a couple things to think about. One is that the oldest Gen Zers right now are like maybe 23 or 24. So I think we've got maybe 5 years before we really start to see a lot of Gen Z entering politics. Of course there are some really exciting young people who are running on the state and local level, but it's going to be a second before Gen Z kind of gets their footing enough to really in big numbers start running for office. Frankly, probably more like 10 years. So that's one thing I would say. And I think that let's say it's 10 years. What happens in those 10 years elsewhere in our political system will really affect how Gen Z operates within that system. So I could see, for example, a world where, given that the Republican Party is really, really struggling with young people, given that they are extremely over-reliant on older white people as their voting base, and that is a not replenishable supply of voters, I think there's a world where the Republican Party voting base over the course of the next 10 years radically shrinks, and either the Republican Party as we know it disappears, which I think is extremely unlikely, or the Republican Party as we know it radically shifts and morphs in order to appeal to young people and people of color. And depending on how they do that and how effectively they do that, what happens if there's a Republican AOC who is a young woman of color who is speaking about conservative ideas in a way that appeals to other young people of color, right? It's not impossible. I also think that there's a world where, depending on what happens with the Democratic Party, there could be a world where if, let's say, let's say the next Democratic president is a Bernie Sanders style progressive, and he moves the Democratic Party significantly to the left, maybe there are some young people who are maybe more in an Obama mold, and they might not be comfortable with, maybe they don't like socialism. You know, socialism, that's another thing I unpack in the book. It has certainly lost its sting among young people, but it's just not true that the majority of young people are card-carrying socialists. It's not something that like turns people off in the same way that it does for boomers, but I think the popularity of socialism among young people as like an ideology is a little bit manipulated. So like, I think that there's a world where, depending on where the Democratic Party goes and depending on where the Republican Party goes, you're still going to always have a lot of people in the middle. So depending on where those lines are drawn, if the Democratic Party moves too far left and the Republican Party moves into the center, you could have a lot of Gen Z Republicans. So I think it's too early to tell exactly what that will look like, but I do think that the Republican Party, as it stands right now, is not doing great with Gen Z.
We got an audience request for one more question. So this is the actual last question, but it should be a fun one. So the question comes from Catherine Buck, also a student at St. Anselm College, and she asks, what was your favorite chapter to research and write, and why?
Ooh, great question. Let me think. Oh, okay. I liked the chapter on AOC's trip to Standing Rock, because that was the day that I found AOC's secret Facebook videos. I was the first person to find them, and I was the first reporter to find her personal Facebook. And the day that I found them, I was like, oh my God, like, because it was a huge deal, right? So finding those videos was huge. And, you know, the other thing is that as a reporter, you know, if I had just sat down, and even if I'd had hours and hours of interviews with AOC, which I didn't, I had some time with her, but not as much as I would have liked. Even if I had said, hey, tell me everything about Standing Rock, I want to hear all of it. Like, she never would have remembered the Cheetos. She never would have known what song they were listening to. She never would have been able, like, you know, when you describe something to somebody 8 years later, 6 years later, I guess it was a little less than that, 4 years later even, you don't remember every single detail. But having hours and hours of live video footage about exactly the event that I was writing about was like a gold mine. And I think that that's something that we're going to see a lot more of as more millennials and Gen Z come into office, and also as more millennials and Gen Z people start reporting on this, is this combination of both traditional political reporting and also essentially social media stalking. Because that's what I did to all these characters, is that I just was like, I stalked them the way I would stalk an ex-boyfriend, like online, where I was like, I need to know everything about you. I'm going to click on every single one of your Facebook photos. I'm going to, you know, so I think that was the most fun, is the day that I found those videos. I was like, gold mine.
Great. Well, Charlotte, we can't thank you enough for doing this, albeit virtually. I know I enjoyed this so much, and I can tell the rest of our students who tuned in did as well. We want to say also a special thank you to Neil and of course the events office at school for helping to put this together. And yeah,
thank you so much for having me, guys. This was
our
so
pleasure.
much fun.
Of course, it was great.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Neil.
Just a quote or quotes from your own book to help us wrap up tonight that we really enjoyed. The youngest generation will be watching, and that future, regardless of the outcome in 2020, has already arrived.
Well, you guys are the future. So if you're interested in politics, that makes me feel better, because if people like you are interested in getting involved in the political system, then I think we'll be okay.
Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Charlotte.